In this video, I will attempt to recreate the original Slenderman game in Unreal Engine 5, but on top of that, I've also made it publicly available right now to play without even having to download it. More on that at the end of the video, but if you do enjoy this, then please do consider hitting subscribe, notification bell, all that good stuff. Now, without further ado, let's head straight into it. So I've been itching to make a new project in Unreal. For the past year and a bit, I've been mostly working on my Cozy Cafe game, and that's still being worked on, but I thought to give myself a break and kind of get into Halloween spirit, I would make something. And although I'm late, I thought it'd still be appropriate to theme a project or a game around that. But then I thought, wait a minute, what's easier than coming up with a completely original, unique idea? That's right, recreating an old one. And you know the only horror game that I've played since the 2010s? Slenderman. Now, I've actually never made a horror game before. My current long-term project is basically the complete opposite, being a cozy cafe game. So I thought I'd reach out to a friend of mine, Blake, who makes PS1 horror games, for some advice. Blake, my man, how you going?
I'm good, Nathan. How are you?
Good. I have some questions because, as you know, I usually just make cozy, cute games, wholesome games, things that are good. But I have no experience making anything of the kind of scary. But you do. So I was wondering if you had any advice or tips for me.
What you really want to focus on with horror is creating an atmosphere that really creates a sense of dread in the player. Like, you want to keep things slow in the beginning. Like with my game Sleigh Bells, it's very slow to begin with. I don't jump straight into the horror. It like sets the characters up and sets the world up. And you kind of want to just like let the tension build as much as you can. And then all of this should really lead up to like a big reveal. This will usually be your monster or serial killer in my cases. Most of my games have someone chasing you with a machete or axe.
Really good points. I have one question though, because I'm remaking the old Slender game from back in the day. Is there anything you would do now if you were to make that game? Anything you would add or change or kind of really focus on?
Two things. One would be visuals, which as you're using Unreal 5 for your game, you're obviously not going to have much of an issue there. But there's also like a lot that I would keep the same about Slenderman. I think the atmosphere is pretty great. The pacing is also not bad for a short horror game. But the second thing that I would focus on personally is I would make the game a hell of a lot more violent. The original game is quite almost PG rated in a sense. There's very little gore, and these are all things that I'd love to put in my games. You know, I would have blood flying everywhere and heads being chopped off and people with their intestines spilled out all over the floor. Like, you should be able to rip off your face.
Like, that was fantastic. You give me a lot to think about and a lot to work on with this new Slenderman game, and I will be sure to keep in contact with you because there's definitely a few more things we need to talk about later down the track. But thank you for the advice you've given me. Hopefully, you know, you can play the Slender game when it's finished. That'd be really good. Get your feedback on it.
I would love to, Nathan. Thanks for having me.
All right. Have a good day then.
I will. You too.
Now, aside from Blake, who's now under house arrest and who's been linked to several murder cases in his area, I've also got a friend Oscar who makes some amazing tracks. Like, stuff like this he just uploads randomly onto Twitter. And I've asked him if he can do something a little bit different for my Slenderman game in giving sound effects as well as some ambient sound or intensity. So hopefully he gets back to me with something and we can put it into the project as well. After organising a therapist and 24-hour security surveillance on Blake, I started off by creating a new project in Unreal using the first-person template. To begin with, I made a new terrain and then imported some Megascan assets for the grass and the dirt. The next big step was setting up the master material for the terrain by creating new layers for the grass and the dirt and later that on track, you know, doing like a mulch or a pathway and stuff like that. So here you can see me just drawing out, making sure that system's all working. With the first person controller here, and then I move on to getting the sky dark and making sure the lighting is appropriate. We want this game to be scary. But since the level's now dark, I worked on the torch to try and get that sizing correct. It's one thing I played around with a lot actually, looking at the reference to the old Slenderman game. You have a very narrow field of view, and so I was kind of figuring out how the feel was affected by the length of the torchlight. And so I kind of ended up on a happy medium where you couldn't see everything, and especially after adding a texture to that torchlight, you see a lot less in the level, which is something that's very similar to the original game as well. And by this point, I was quite impressed at how quickly I was able to get the vibe down, taking away the directional lighting, changing the sky to a nighttime sky, and adding a simple torchlight. It felt like I was already in a Slenderman game. But, of course, the game wouldn't be a Slenderman game without Slenderman, so I imported a free asset from online. Here I'm playing around with the materials because he came in very shiny, added more roughness to him, and the normal maps and specular maps and stuff are a bit messed up from the FBX model. And also, I imported him as absolutely massive, which, you know, is terrifying in the editor, to say the least. But in the game, all you'd see is a shoe, which might not be as scary. So I'm fixing the scale here now, going through, re-importing and updating, making sure the height is correct. And so after a few attempts, I eventually got the height at a stage where I was happy. You can see in the editor, he's a bit taller, you know, a head or two taller than you. And from a distance, yeah, this is it. This is our Slenderman. I then made sure the blueprint was set up properly, making sure his direction was correct. And then it was time to begin on the Slenderman logic. But the first part of getting him to move when you're not looking at him was quite interesting to figure out, because there's a few ways you could do it. There's a function in the blueprint system where it's basically asking if an actor is being rendered on screen. So originally I was using that, and so when you looked away, obviously he wasn't being rendered, which would then cause him to move closer to the player. However, there's a caveat with this, where if an object's in front of him, in the rendering system, the Slenderman's still being rendered, but then other things being rendered on top of him. So then when you call that node of, has he been rendered, then technically yes, he's been rendered, but the player actually doesn't see him. So I had an issue where if he was on corners in like the toilet block, or if he was behind a tree and stuff, and you physically couldn't see him in the game, he was still being rendered, and therefore the logic there was invalid, because you still want him moving even if he's been technically rendered on screen, but not being seen by the player. But then it was time to start working on the map. I basically got the overview of the map from the original game and tried the best to freehand it while also putting in some of the primitive structures just so I could get the scale down. I also did some brush editing for the bathrooms as well as the tunnel, thinking hopefully I could get away with doing it. Unfortunately, in the end, I ended up having to recreate things in Blender just because of the UV unwrapping and adding some bevels or subdivisions, especially to the tunnel as well, which at the start is quite primitive. But for the cross fence, I just imported some Megascan assets with this like cobblestone wall, put them together and basically did the layout like that. And I'm quite happy how it turned out, you know, slapping on some Megascan materials in a darkly lit scene with torchlight makes most things look pretty good, except for these rocks. These rocks, luckily, I replaced later with actual meshes because having them as just spheres did not work out or look good. And a funny thing happened actually, because I was walking around the level testing the scene. I forgot that I set up the Slenderman AI, so I scared myself while exploring the level, which for me isn't very hard to do, but it was funny for me as a designer being like, okay, cool. Even just wandering around when there's no threat, this still gave me a jump scare. Now here you can see me doing the good old level design rule 101 of using the same asset over and over but rotating it in different directions to make it look like it's unique and different for the rocks, which now look a lot nicer. I will admit, Megascan assets, given the right lighting and the right size and textures and everything, look really good in their environment. One thing I wish I could have added to this game but didn't have time to was actual terrain blending you can have with certain assets in the game. So if you're in a grass environment, grass actually blends up to an asset. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, this would have been way too much effort for a project that is unfortunately a lot shorter term. And so after adding some trees and grass and playing around a little bit with the post-processing, the game is really starting to take shape. And so the next mechanic I decided to implement were the pages, which are simply just a decal, which is a projection of like a sheet of crumpled paper with a box collider on top of it. And the player shoots a raycast, then it responds with the UI widget to say, hey, collect this. And then a domino effect happens with the player blueprint checking how many pages have been collected and then referencing with Slenderman what state he should be in. But one issue I kept running into when placing the pages around the scene seen were two things. One were the collisions of the objects I was placing the pages on. Sometimes you couldn't actually press them. But the other thing was placing them in the wrong normal map direction. So if I'd done it upside down, then the page would look black. So I'd have to go around and double check the pages were facing in the right direction. Now, going into this, I might have been just a little bit naive or maybe overly optimistic with the quality of the game that I wanted. As you can see here, I'm placing a lot of foliage, lots of grass, lots of trees, and it wasn't until a bit later when I started doing some optimization that I realized that a lot of the stuff was very poorly optimized. The leaves, especially on the trees that I was using, were not good, and it wasn't until very late in the project when I realized I was getting like between 20 to like 45 frames, which is something that, I'm very much a snob of. I like my 60 frames at least for my games. Going through, checking the materials and trying to fix that. Afterwards, I moved on to importing some screen static and glitches and learnt a lot about Unreal's media player. And so here I've just imported a bunch of free online glitches, and I'm getting a screenshot for the Slender Man. And with these together, I'll then go back into my editing program, DaVinci Resolve, put them together to kind of make a single game over screen. I thought the best way to get a screenshot of the Slender Man as well was to have it within the editor. So I just grabbed the Slender mesh, had him facing up towards the sky, added a red spotlight to highlight his silhouette, and then set up the post-processing and general lighting, and then simply took a screenshot of it. Once I was happy with the screenshot, I took it over into DaVinci Resolve along with some of the other glitches and basically layered them on top of each other. So I had the screenshot underneath on the bottom layer, and the top layer, I had the different glitch clips in different composite modes, whether it was additive or multiply or whatever, and then basically played around with the coloring for Slender Man, making him look brighter, making the colors pop a bit more. Some of them quite desaturated, so I increased the saturation. And once I was happy with how the clip looked, I rendered it out and imported it into Unreal. Now, the next challenge was figuring out how to actually play the video clip, because I was seeing online some tutorials, people were just using the media player onto a 3D plane, which they'd have in front of the player's camera, which I'm not necessarily a fan of. It's a very duct tape approach, I think. And so what I did was I actually went through with widgets and figured out how to make the video a material for the widget, and then set up a flow of blueprints that would reference the material and then play the video image on top of it. And since I was working on the gameplay widget, I decided to implement little interaction icons for collecting the pages, as well as implementing the text that says how many pages you've collected thus far within the game. And so here I'm just laying out the hand icon as well as the text, and then finding some nice fun scribbly fonts on DaFont that were free and available for me to use. And so once I was happy with the widget layout, I went into the blueprints and started to set up both when the hand icon would be activated, which is whenever the player is hovering or the raycast is interfacing with a collider that is the page, as well as the text. So when the player inputs, making sure that then the number of pages that collected appear on screen for a number of times, just adding a delay node basically saying show this for like 5 seconds and then disappearing, as well as also destroying the page actor within the level itself. And so this is how it all turned out. Next was doing more set dressing for the level, and so here I got like a giant tree stump I was able to use, and just making sure the collisions weren't colliding with each other so you could actually select the page. And then I moved on to working on the tunnel. So I had that brush mesh from before, I exported it out as an FBX, put it into Blender, basically used it as a scale reference, and then kind of made my own cylinder again. And I basically did this for two reasons. One was because obviously, despite having a good material on it, it was repeating way too much. So you can see me here doing some UV unwrapping. And the other thing was everything looked very smooth in the level except for this one tunnel. And because it's concrete and it would have been shaped and not had those rigid edges, I kind of wanted to remove that because I felt like, although this game I think graphically isn't my best work, by the end things were quite rushed. But when you actually play the game, there are definitely lots of elements that I wish I could have added more to, but just didn't have time to really push it in terms of its visual fidelity. So once the mesh was in a place that I was happy with in terms of being smooth, I exported it out as an FBX with UV unwrapped as well, and basically placed it in the scene as close as humanly possible to the original brush mesh, and then also generate convex colliders as well, which are a little complex, I think, for this model. As you can see here, the textures are still a little bit too stretched, but it was at the point now where I thought it looked a lot better than before, and I had to move on to other things. But, you know, it's still, man, Megascan textures and just meshes in general make things so much easier. And then here, I just imported some assets from the marketplace that was some gas tankers, which were just, you know, the same thing, duplicated over and over. I realized now, playing back in the old Slender game, that they were rotated in a different orientation, but that's fine. And then here, I'm just moving on to doing the toilet block as well, which I did a more simpler version just because, funnily enough, couldn't find an easy online way to get a model reference for the toilets without ripping the whole game. So what I did here instead was I would make a simple cube and export it as an FBX, put it in the level, and then make changes within Blender, re-export it and re-import it, and then basically walk around within the engine to see the scale. Like you can see here, the hallway's a bit tight, and I forgot that I hadn't added collisions yet. And then I'd simply go back to Blender and fix the mesh and the layout of it all, and then UV unwrap it and apply some more Megascan materials. And this is how it turned out in the engine, which I think it looks pretty darn schmick considering it's just 2 to 3 materials without anything else. Next, I was able to implement some of the sound effects and music because Oscar sent them all through. Absolute legend. Listen to some of these tracks. They are terrifying and stress-inducing. Now, before we finish up, I just want to say that there were 3 things that I was definitely not happy with how this project turned out. One was I really wished I could have fixed the fading more between the static. Sometimes it glitches out when you look away, as well as having a fade in for the game over event. Sometimes it would just pop up. I wish there was more of a lerp or transition from going to staticky and then the game over screen. That's just something, unfortunately, I didn't have time for. And things like timers and events and that sort of stuff can get quite confusing and caught up in, especially in blueprints. And at this point, the project's kind of gone over its deadline. And so that's one thing that I kind of want to revisit and understanding so I can get a bit quicker at doing that next time. And the other thing I'm really upset about is the fact that the footsteps on the different terrains no longer work. For some reason, the timeline that's in the blueprint has just stopped working, and it actually crashes now when I try to implement certain things and open it, which I don't want to touch right now. I'd probably have to delete all that stuff and do it again, but because of the time constraints here, I can't actually do anything right now. Maybe in the future, if I do a second update and maybe get some feedback from you all, I might re-implement it, but unfortunately, it's one of the things that it really added to the game, but I can't fix it right now because we need to get this project out there. And the final thing also was, for some reason, the toilets, the bathrooms or whatever, the shading was messed up. I think it's something to do with the Megascan materials as well as the model itself. It's just something that it makes it look a little bit broken and not as nice being in Unreal, unfortunately. But that's just something that is probably a checkbox I haven't checked and I don't have time to look at it. So those are the 3 things. Please forgive me. I'm sorry. I'm aware. And if I had more time, I would definitely commit myself to fixing these errors. And with that, the game is done. But wait. I'm not finished yet. The real reason why I wanted to make this video game project is to find a solution to a problem that I have. You see, a year ago, I switched from using Unity to Unreal, and for the most part, I've absolutely loved my experience. One key feature, though, that is missing from Unreal, especially since Unreal Engine 5, is the ability to port to web. If I'm being honest, maybe it's just me showing my age and nostalgia, but I miss the days of online web games. I miss the days of Flash. I hate the fact Steve Jobs basically just killed off an entire gaming industry because he didn't like Flash or whatever Adobe was doing. But I still believe browsers are a very accessible way for people to experience and play games. So when Arcane Mirage reached out to me saying they had a service that would allow anyone, no matter their PC specs, to play my Unreal Engine 5 games, I jumped at the opportunity. Now, I will say for transparency, this isn't a sponsorship. I've received no money or endorsement. For me, this is just experimenting with different methods of online web development, basically. Links in the description. You can play Slender 2024 right now, but be sure to also check back here because, like I said, there were some changes and updates I wanted to make, and I might just decide to upload it all to itch with those changes and updates as well, if you want to play the game locally on your PC. So keep an eye out for that. And as well, I want to give a big shout out to my YouTube members. You guys are amazing and awesome. Thank you for giving your support to me month by month. Their names are right here. If you want more game dev goodness, then please do consider following along. And if you enjoyed this video, then consider watching my 5 days of solo game dev, where I go through Monday to Friday of me working on my Cozy Cafe game using Unreal Engine.